Hello and welcome to week two. This is the video introduction to help orient us to not only the authors that we have for week two, Bertrand Russell and Thomas Aquinas, but also a little bit about how to read them, or at least how to read Thomas Aquinas, because he's writing in the Middle Ages, and so his whole form and structure uh, is very foreign to us, and so I find it helpful to understand what he's doing in order to understand how to read it, therefore how to take any sort of message or claim that he's making, right? In this previous week, thank you for posting your introductions and beginning the process of responding to me. That wasn't necessary. Week one is not graded. If you haven't yet signed up, however, for a week to lead a discussion to the class, please do so quickly. I've put your names in parentheses under each week on the content page behind the section that you're reading, and there's still a few of you out there who haven't let me know which week you'd like to lead. But I tried to respond to most, if not all of us, in a way to show you sort of how a response to one of these somebody's posts can go, right? So I posed additional questions. I tried to unpack a little bit on some of them, what I thought you were saying, and then asked you, did I get it right, right? These are the kinds of ways to sort of like help foster an online conversation. So take that as a model. Our leaders for this week will begin posting, and so from week 2 to week 7, we've got a pretty standard schedule. Remember, the post should be up late Saturday night at the latest. You're welcome, leaders, you're welcome to post those early. Post each question as a separate thread so that we can have our conversations nest properly underneath. And for everyone else, please post by your first post by Monday night. As soon as you post once, it'll open up so that you can then begin to read what everyone else has posted, and then have your reply to someone else done by Wednesday night. Now, you're not limited to 2. I only grade 2. So if a conversation rolls, somebody asks questions, don't think that I've done my 2 and therefore I'm that's it, right? I'm also looking for how we're having a conversation over the course of these next weeks as well. All right, so we have 2 readers for this week, and I'm kind of playing around in this online format with how to have a conversation between these 2, because I have one leader posting questions about Aquinas, one leader posting questions about Bertrand Russell, and my fear is that we'll have 2 separate conversations going, but I want them to kind of overlap. So in your first posts, or even your second posts, please try to find and push one another in ways that will help us understand a conversation between Russell and Aquinas, rather than having 2 separate individual conversations. When I teach this class in a longer format, we do 1 week on one and 1 week on another, and then we're able to bring those together a little bit more concisely. But here I'm condensing it down a little bit and shortening the reading assignments for it as well. So a little bit about Aquinas and how to read him. Now I'm going to give us a little bit of background information as well in order to help orient us towards these different readers, right? So Thomas Aquinas is born in 1225 CE, right? So Middle Ages. This is a time in European civilization when humanism is on the rise. And with humanism comes a keen interest in what's called natural theology. Now, up to this point, theology has been done, the theology being the ways that Christians think about who God is. Theology has been done primarily from the place of revelation, right? So especially special revelation. So God has somehow revealed God's self to humanity, whether that's in scriptural texts, whether that's in prophets speaking, whether that's in sort of like these monastic communities and how they interpret and unpack sacred text. But what happens in the Middle Age, in this point in the Middle Ages, is that we have the birth of natural theology, which means we're looking and trying to understand, can we know anything about God and God's ways by looking at the natural world around us, right? So we're not going first and foremost to Scripture and what God has how God has revealed God's self in Scripture. We're looking at the world around us to try to understand from this vantage point, looking up, can we understand and know anything about God, right? And so this is where we're going to get a lot of proofs for the existence of God. And here in question 2, Aquinas gives us 5 proofs for the existence of God, right? So let me back up just a minute and give us a little bit more background on Aquinas, the person first, and then unpack sort of how he writes Summa Theologica and what these 5 ways are, and then his discussion on evil in question 49. So Aquinas, again, born in Italy, Roccasecca, I don't know how you pronounce that in Italian, in Italy. He becomes a Dominican friar. He is nicknamed, when he's in grade school, the equivalent of grade school, the dumb ox. And there's several sort of theories, modern theories, about why he's called this. Lots of different traditions that tell this story in a different way. So I'm going to give you my favorite interpretation of this tradition. He's called the dumb ox not because he is necessarily inept at intellectual thinking, dumb, but because he's dumb in the sense that he's never really speaking, right? And as a kid, he's a little bit overweight, and so he's the object of ridicule anyway. And this is the story I like. He's in class, and he's known for not ever saying a single word, right? And so he's got this nickname, the dumb ox. One day the teacher, because teachers are sadistic like this, right? Wants to sort of like either press into Aquinas, challenge him, or at least make an object lesson and say, hey, don't be like this kid over here who never talks, right? Had this really, really complex theological idea up on the chalkboard or whatever. And says, hey, Aquinas, come up and solve this, right? This is like the question of the ages at the time. Nobody can really figure this out. How do we even begin? None of his peers. And remember, this kid's like 8 years old. Aquinas gets up there, and so this story goes. For the next 2 or 3 days, proceeds to give a systematic explanation of how to approach and understand this huge human conundrum, right? Which totally dumbfounds, to turn the nickname in on itself, dumbfounds not only the teacher, but the fellow students, and he goes on from there to be this great person, right? So Aquinas actually, he's this majorly prolific systematician. His whole goal is to try to like bring together all of the understandings of Christian theology into a coherent whole, into one system. And so what we get in Summa Theologica is this sort of like going through piece by piece, systematically explaining, starting here in question 2, with can we know anything about who God is just using our faculties of reason and observation, right? Systematically going through and understanding and explaining what Christian belief is all about, right? What it's based upon. Is there any founding? He deals with a series of objections in every single question. So when you get into there, he's gonna have this structure, right? He's gonna say, here's an idea, here's an idea, here's an idea, here's an objection. Here's how I'm gonna answer all of those other things. His main point, the argument that he is putting forward, doesn't come in these little questions until you get to the I answer that section. You with me so far? All right, so here's some things that other people have said. Now, he may believe them, he may not. He doesn't really tell us until you get to his answers to those objections. But he's really wanting to put forth the I answer that section. The other is just sort of like the conversation that we read playing out on the page. Does that make sense? Now, he's going to talk about a couple of folks, and if you ever read more of Thomas, you'll see this more often, right? He's going to talk and reference 2 people by title, not by name, sometimes by name. The first is he who he calls the apostle capital A apostle, he's talking about the Apostle Paul from Scripture there. And whenever he says the philosopher, he's talking about Aristotle. So there's a long history about why Aristotle is important. Europe had sort of largely lost touch with Aristotle because largely intellectual circles in Europe favored Plato. And so we just forget about, I don't know how this happens, right? But we forget about Aristotle when Europeans cruise over to the Holy Lands in the Crusades and they start battling the Moors and the other Muslim groups. We realize that these Muslims have had amazing scholars who have actually preserved Greek philosophers better than we have. And they've actually been preserving the works of Aristotle in ways that we had totally forgotten in the West. And so when we come back, when Europeans come back to Europe, they bring not only the relics and all the sort of like plunder of their endeavors over there, but they bring back a new intellectual tradition. And so Aristotle, right, becomes the chief name of the game because he's sort of like breathing a breath of fresh air in on a very stale, Platonic, European thought life, right? And if you remember the difference between, or maybe you don't know at all, Plato and Aristotle, right? Plato begins up here in the world of ideas, of forms, right, and says, if there's something here in this world, it's because it's a reflection of the form. So he starts with the form, and this is just sort of a copy of it in some debased way. Aristotle goes the other direction, right? Aristotle starts with the things of this world, right? He starts with what we have here and works out that direction. Can we know anything about God? Aquinas wants to ask from an Aristotelian perspective, from the perspective of natural theology. By just looking and observing this world here, and making guesses, right? It's a different approach and one that's new for many Europeans at this point. All right, so that's Thomas Aquinas. I only have a few minutes left to talk about, or at least introduce Bertrand Russell. He's a modern writer, so he's much more easy and straightforward. Russell is born to a noble family. I think his mom is a baroness or something like that. Back in 1872, right? So he died in I believe 1970 of influenza. But he's orphaned at a really young age. His parents can't decide what to do. His mom wants to raise him in the church. His dad says screw that and asks John Stuart Mill to be his godfather. And through whatever, Mill died during the year that Russell was born, so he never ended up being Russell's godfather, right? But Russell is this amazing sort of like thinker, and his dad wanted him to be raised an agnostic, to think and to really learn to question all things, not just issues of science and religion. He studies and wins the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1950. He works with great philosopher Whitehead, a mathematician, produces this amazing work called Intro to Mathematical Philosophy or Philosophical Principles while he's actually in prison. He's in Britain, born in Britain. He's in prison at various points, or at least like restricted from traveling, or he gets like a lectureship somewhere and it gets revoked. All this stuff happens because he's an outspoken advocate for human rights and opposing World War II and other war systems, nuclear proliferation and these other things. So he gets thrown into jail a few times. He gets invited over to Harvard at one point to lecture at Harvard in stateside, and the British customs won't grant him a visa to travel because they're pissed off at him for producing all these anti-war pamphlets. He writes this stuff here. You'll see and get sort of a flavor for his understanding of this questions of belief and unbelief that we're discussing in our class. A couple other things that might be important to your understanding of Russell. He's married a couple of times. He starts in 1927 with his first wife, this school for young children who were disadvantaged. Remember, he's orphaned as a young kid. He's actually picked up as a ward of the state, and then custody is granted to his grandmother. who violates Russell's father's wishes to raise him as an agnostic, and she raises him as a Christian. And let's see. Yeah, so know that this man is a humanitarian. He's an outspoken critic of World War I, of Hitler, of Stalin, of U.S.'s involvement in Vietnam, of nuclear proliferation. He's always championing humanitarian ideals and freedom of thought, right? So that's who we get when we read Russell. He's not a flat character at all. So please keep that in mind as you read and engage him. And I hope to really be energized by our conversations this next week.